How's it going, folks? I'm Des with DesFit, and this is the new Suunto 9 Peak Pro. Suunto's update to the Suunto 9 Peak that came out over a year ago, and today we're going to find out what makes this Pro. So on the surface, well, you can barely even tell there's anything different with the Suunto 9 Peak Pro, and it's virtually identical on the outside, but it's what's on the inside that counts with the Suunto 9 Peak Pro that actually makes a difference. So I've been testing out the new Suunto 9 Peak Pro for the last couple weeks, and in this video, I'll be going over what you need to know about all the new features, what's different about this Pro model versus the previous generation, as well as how well it actually performs for sports. And just like all my reviews, I'll be going into tons of detail about the GPS and heart rate accuracy. And if the information in this video does help you out at all, do me a favor and just quickly hit that like button down below. It's a small little thing that you can do that will help this video and the channel quite a bit, and I appreciate it. The previous generation Suunto 9 Peak was very much about taking what they had already in past models and repackaging a lot of that stuff into this newly designed case. The Suunto 9 Peak Pro, however, takes it one step further by updating the internals quite a bit with stuff like a faster processor, as well as a new heart rate sensor while keeping the outside virtually the same. But just like the previous generation, it's built with durability in mind with a sapphire lens to protect the touchscreen display. It also has a really thin and durable case that's made out of either stainless steel or titanium. And I know looks are all personal preference and all, but I actually love the look of the Suunto 9 Peak and the Suunto 9 Peak Pro. These are easily some of my favorites when it comes to watch design. However, we should probably talk about that elephant in the room, the bezel. So yep, that bezel is definitely still there, and yes, it's still hard to ignore, but it got me thinking, how big actually is that bezel? And I'm specifically talking about the distance from the edge of the display to the outside of the case. I know the term bezel can be used in a few different ways, but I thought this may be a somewhat fair way of comparing since some watches may have an additional metal ring that also could be constituted as a bezel. Anyways, for the Suunto 9 Peak Pro, the distance from the edge of the display to the outside of the case is right around 6.5 millimeters. However, let's take something like the Forerunner 745, which I found to be very similar in terms of dimensions, and although the bezel area looks more thin, or maybe a better term would be less obvious, the distance from the edge of the display to the outside of the case is actually virtually identical. It's just that with the 745, the edge of the case kind of curves up a bit, and they also have some additional but subtle markings on this portion right here that kind of detract your eye a little bit. With the Suunto 9 Peak Pro, it's just that the edge of the case is just so darn thin and they don't have anything additional on this rather large black surface here that could potentially make that area look a little bit smaller. And then for another example, here's the Forerunner 955 Solar. So the same thing here where the outside edge kind of curves up like the 745. And then there's also the additional solar ring that takes up some of that space. And then even with the new Chorus Apex 2 Pro, same deal here where they have a rather large metal bezel along with an additional accent ring on the black portion, which makes that distance look a little bit smaller. Anyhow, my whole point with all that is that yes, that bezel absolutely does stick out, but in the whole scheme of things, the only reason it does stick out is that, first of all, that case is so darn thin, and Suunto just doesn't do as good of a job of hiding it as other manufacturers, and they're probably not putting anything additional on that black area to kind of hit that minimalistic design. However, the other elephant in the room is the display, and it's just, again, kind of hard to ignore where it's just kind of dim compared to some other watches, and unless you're looking at it directly head on, it can be a little bit challenging to see, especially at off angles. And it appears to me that the distance from the display to the top of the lens may have something to do with that. Now, in terms of what's changed on the inside, they have a new processor and MCU, which absolutely makes a big difference, where now getting around the device with their refreshed user interface is a super smooth experience, and everything is just nice and snappy, whether you're using the buttons or the touchscreen. And if you've used Suunto watches before in the past, you may have just noticed that the interface was just a little bit laggy and kind of sluggish, but there's really none of that with the new Suunto 9 Peak Pro. You also may notice new fonts and UI changes like color overlays and areas where they've increased contrast between different elements, which definitely makes things a lot more distinguishable, which also helps with that user experience. And yet another new thing with the Suunto 9 Peak Pro on the inside is that they've also increased the battery life significantly, where you can get up to 30 days of standby use as a smartwatch, which is over double the 14 days that you can get on their previous generation. And a lot of that does have to do with that new Power Efficient Mcu. And then in addition, for GPS battery life for recording outdoor activities, that's also improved significantly with up to 40 hours in the most powerful recording mode versus 25 hours on the previous generation, and then up to 70 hours in its endurance battery mode where it reduces samplings to extend battery life. And then the Suunto 9 Peak Pro also has a fast charging feature where if you notice you're low on juice, if you just place it on the charger for just 10 minutes, they say that you can get up to 10 hours of runtime for tracking an outdoor activity. The new Suunto 9 Peak Pro also comes with a GPS chipset that can leverage all 5 major satellite systems, but just note, it's not dual band or dual frequency. However, this is kind of a spoiler alert, but for not being dual band or dual frequency, it actually still performs quite well, even in challenging environments. The Suunto 9 Peak Pro also adds wrist-based running power, so at this point, basically every major manufacturer when it comes to GPS smartwatch has wrist-based running power. And for how it compares, it seems to line up pretty well with the numbers that are collected from something like a Chorus watch or Stride FootPod, and the trends seem to line up pretty well too, although it did have 2 spots on this run where it dropped out. However, you still can use a Stride FootPod with the 9 Peak Pro if you'd like, and at that point it'll ignore the wrist-based running power that's being collected on the watch. And then in addition to wrist-based running power, Suunto also provides NGP or normalized graded pace in your activity details. Now, there are 2 rather big ticket items that didn't come with the Suunto 9 Peak Pro, and it didn't come with the Suunto 9 Peak before it either, and that's going to be any music storage or playback, and it also doesn't come with maps, but there is breadcrumb functionality at least. And then in terms of sport profiles, the Suunto 9 Peak Pro has nearly everything under the sun that you can think of. Being a full-on multi-sport watch with triathlon capabilities, of course that has all the stuff you'd expect, like running both outdoors and indoors, cycling both outdoors and indoors as well. There's weight training, pool swimming and open water swimming, mountaineering, yoga, obstacle course racing. I mean, the list kind of goes on and on and on. It's kind of nuts. But one rather interesting new workout profile though they have is something called mermaiding. And before this, I never even heard about this, but of course I had to try it out. So from my understanding, this is basically like shallow freediving or snorkeling without a snorkel. Correct me if I'm wrong, by the way. And what this activity profile does is it provides you with your dive time, your rest time in between dives, as well as a depth gauge and timer during each dive along with the current number of dives. And although I was just testing this in a 5-foot deep pool, I did find the depth gauge to be pretty sensitive, as you can see here as I was rising. And then what it'll do after you save your activities, it'll give you a breakdown of all this information with a dive profile chart of your activity, and then all the details of each dive broken out. Pretty neat. I was only able to test this out in my gym pool as it's fall in Colorado right now and the outside water temps are not so ideal, so I was only able to test it down to 5 feet, but apparently it will track depth down to 10 meters. All right, so moving on to some things that I'm a bit more accustomed to testing, let's talk about GPS accuracy as well as hardware accuracy. So the Suunto 9 Peak Pro comes with a GPS chipset that can leverage all 5 major satellite systems. It's not the dual band or dual frequency mode that you're seeing on some competitor devices like the Chorus Apex 2 Pro or the Forerunner 955, but even so, the performance was very respectable, and I tested in some pretty challenging environments. So starting out with something on the easier side of things for GPS accuracy, here's a road ride that was for the most part out in the wide open without many obstructions or anything like that that could impair GPS accuracy. And we see that everything lines up well between all the devices. Good to go. And then on the GPS track side of things, in terms of the finer detail, it was really quite good here, where on all the straight sections of the road, there wasn't any drift or anything like that. And then even on all these curvy sections of the bike path, it was nice and crisp. But now let's get to something that's a bit more challenging with a trail run. And here's where we can see that the total distance was close to the other devices, but a smidge over the other devices, as well as the corrected distance in Strava. And before we get into the GPS track accuracy, I also wanted to point out that it did a decent job with the elevation gain on this run being pretty close. And then for the finer detail of the GPS track accuracy, well, this was a really, really challenging environment where there was tons of overhead tree cover and there were plenty of rock faces right beside the trail. So this was a pretty good test to see how well it would do, even without the dual band technology, and the Suunto 9 Peak Pro held its own pretty darn well here. So right here, it did wiggle off the trail just slightly, but really not that far off by any means. And then moving up the trail here on these extremely tight switchbacks, it also did a pretty decent job. And just to give you an idea of how challenging an environment this actually was, if I switch over to satellite view, well, you can't even see the trail. Now, moving on to the backside of the mountain here, we see that the Suunto 9 Peak Pro did veer off the trail slightly, but not quite as much as the Chorus Apex 2 that's in purple. And this is the base model Apex 2 without the dual band technology. So that's where you can see sort of a side-by-side comparison of watches with similar GPS technology. But overall, for a trail run like this, the Suunto 9 Peak Pro did a very good job compared to the other devices that had dual band satellite systems. And then last but certainly not least, let's head into the city for a test against some really tall buildings where satellite signals can kind of get iffy. And we see that the Suunto 9 Peak was close, but did come up a little bit short of the corrected distance in Strava. And then in taking a close look at the GPS tracks, as I started things out, things were looking okay, but the 9 Peak Pro did skirt into the street a little bit here, but not that big a deal compared to some of the other devices here. It did a very good job with this section here as I went over a footbridge and then under this tunnel and then back out again. Actually, it did a really good job with this section right here. And then as I ran along the creek, things were looking pretty good, and then it also nailed this corner right here. Now, this section over here looks like a jumbled mess because, well, it kind of is, but this section was basically all through the tall buildings of downtown Denver, but I gotta say, the Suunto 9 Peak Pro did a very respectable job here. Sure, there were some areas where it was in the street just a little bit, but overall, there were sections like over here where things were looking incredibly crispy. And by the way, I wasn't using routing or anything like that where it could have been using the snap to route feature. So overall, even though the Suunto 9 Peak Pro doesn't have a dual band or dual frequency GPS chipset, the results in some really challenging environments were pretty impressive. Something that wasn't quite as impressive though was its ability to estimate distances run on a treadmill, where it did come up quite a bit short on this run. Alright, so moving on to heart rate accuracy, the Suunto 9 Peak Pro also comes with an updated heart rate sensor, and in terms of accuracy, let's start out with some indoor cycling, which is what I use as kind of a baseline test, and the Suunto 9 Peak Pro did a good job here. It was reading a little bit high for the first few seconds of the ride, but that can happen with a lot of optical heart rate sensors, so really not that big a deal. On these increases in heart rate, it did a really good job here, but it did have a handful of spots where it dipped ever so slightly, but those are incredibly minor. Overall, pretty good stuff on the 9 Peak Pro. Now, for heart rate accuracy for running, the Suunto 9 Peak Pro did an okay job, but not necessarily exceptional. There was a bit of a high reading here for a minute or so, and then a bit of general shakiness throughout the run, but in all fairness, the Coros Apex 2 Pro I was wearing on my other wrist was a little bit shaky there too. But there at least weren't any huge spikes or dips or anything like that, so overall I'd say decent and usable, but not necessarily spot on. And then last up is weight training, and it's basically a huge bonus if a watch can actually track this accurately. This kind of activity is just tough for any wrist-based optical heart rate sensor due to all the gripping onto the dumbbells, as well as a lot of varying arm movement that can throw off these types of sensors. And although the Suunto 9 Peak Pro did do a phenomenal job at these high intensity intervals at the end, it did struggle quite a bit with these bicep curls here and here, but was a little bit less off on these tricep extensions here. Okay, so with all that out of the way, we do have to talk about price. So the stainless steel version of the Suunto 9 Peak Pro runs $549 and the titanium version runs $699. And when compared to other watches in that same price range, the feature set simply pales in comparison to something like a Garmin Forerunner 955 or a Coros Apex 2 Pro, where both of those have offline topo and landscape maps, music storage, although the Apex 2 Pro is just MP3 files at the moment, and both those devices also have dual frequency satellite modes. I do absolutely get that the build quality and the materials is pretty darn high end on this device, and in my opinion it has some killer looks to it too, but when you get past the premium materials and the looks and start to look at the features, it gets to be a little bit of a hard sell. So I know that they call this the Suunto 9 Peak Pro, and I do very much think that the new upgrades like the snappier redesigned interface as well as the much longer battery life are great, but in my mind, I'm not sure how it makes it much more pro than the Suunto 9 Peak before it. In my mind, it's more of a solid spec bump rather than a pro level Suunto 9 Peak. Pro in my mind would mean something like offline mapping or music storage or maybe even dual band satellites, but in all fairness, it still did very much hold its own even without dual band. So if you already own a Suunto 9 Peak, I'm not sure if the upgrade path was going to be quite worth it with the Suunto 9 Peak Pro. However, if you own a Suunto 9 Barrow or something like that, this could be definitely worth a look. Anyhow, those are just my thoughts on the Suunto 9 Peak Pro, but I definitely want to hear about what you think as well, so definitely leave your thoughts in the comments section down below, and if you found the information in this video useful, do me a favor and just quickly hit that like button, and also subscribe to the channel for plenty more sports tech videos that are coming soon. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.